Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Death by a Billion Bots. Today we're going to be discussing the findings of Netacea's annual threat report. Joining us on our panel, we have, I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. Over to you first, Cyril.
Hi everyone, my name is Cyril Noltego. I'm Principal Security Researcher here at Netacea.
To you, Tom.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Parker, and I'm a cybersecurity manager at BT.
And finally.
Hi, everyone. Rob Black here. I'm a lecturer in information activities at Cranfield University, where I help teach the British military at the Defence Academy.
Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. Totally forgot to introduce myself. I am Danny Middleton-Wren, and I am Head of Media at Netacea. So yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully today's discussion is going to be a lively one as we get really stuck into these results. Oh, just take us back one before we go forward. Always a great place to start. So just to give you a rundown of what we're going to be covering this afternoon, we're going to give you a little overview of our research, followed by an introduction to the Blade framework with Cyril. We'll go through the attack origins, trends, and some volumes. The impact of bots on businesses, what they're doing to mitigate the threat, and what businesses should be doing now. Okay, so let's start with how we went about collecting our research. So we worked with an organisation called Coleman Parkes, who went out and did a lot of the field work for us. We wanted to discover how businesses are being affected by bots, what they understand about bots, and what they're doing to tackle the growing problem in 2023. So we've been running this report for the last 3 years, since 2020. Forgot all my T's, since 2020. So we've got a nice 3 years worth of data, which means that we're able to observe trends over time, how enterprises have shifted their behavior and how they are tackling bots over that time. And so that's going to be part of the discussion this afternoon. So we spoke to businesses across the UK and the US, over 440 enterprises, including businesses in retail, financial services, telecommunications, travel, and gaming and online entertainment. Okay, so I'm going to ask Cyril, before we get cracking, to give us a nice definition of what bots / malicious automated threats are.
So malicious automated threats, these are threats that are targeting business logic. So as opposed to your traditional cyber attack, which may be something like a ransomware, which is targeting a technical vulnerability, these are malicious automation operating over the internet that's targeting flaws in business logic.
Okay, and so to help us understand this a little bit more in the context of how Blade is applied, do you want to talk us through what are the differences between traditional cyber attacks and malicious automation using credential stuffing as a use case?
Yeah, sure. So, this is a screenshot from the Blade framework, and I'll just explain what the Blade framework is first. So with traditional cyber attacks, you have MITRE ATT&CK, which gives you this knowledge base of the tactics and techniques that attackers use. Now, this didn't work well for business logic attacks, so we created the Blade framework, which stands for the Business Logic Attack Definition Framework. And similar to MITRE, this is an open source knowledge base. But with the Blade framework, we're looking at the phases that business logic attacks proceed through, and then the tactics and techniques that are employed by attackers throughout these phases. So on the screen at the moment, we have an example of a kill chain from the Blade framework of a credential stuffing bot. So across the top, you've got kind of the phases that this goes through, from resource development through to post-attack. And then you've got the tactics that the attacker would use in each phase. So for example, we've got infrastructure acquisition, how they're going to acquire the infrastructure to use in their attack. and then the specific techniques they might use, such as a botnet or proxies that they might use in the attack. And this allows us to understand exactly how flaws in business logic will be attacked and the differences between that and traditional cyber attacks.
Thank you for that, Cyril. I realised as I leapt into that, I just went straight into, Cyril, tell me all about these attacks without actually even introducing what Blade is. So thank you for doing my job for me there. You're a top flight host.
No worries at all.
You're what I aspire to. Okay, so what I'd like to discuss a little bit now with you, Tom, if you wouldn't mind, how you approach, or how one should approach, tackling attacks. So like credential stuffing versus attacks such as ransomware or, other more kind of, I suppose, brute force hacking.
Yeah, okay. So I guess firstly, and as Cyril kind of pointed out, unlike ransomware, bot attacks are, although defined as malicious automation, their objective actually is to target the website through business logic in the way it was kind of designed and intended. And often I think the challenge with bot attacks on business is actually due to the level of availability unknowingly that a business gives to a bot in terms of an attacker. I think that you can't solely rely on a single traditional cyber threat and detect response model to be effective. I think that it requires a operating model that spans across multiple teams within your business. The response needs to be multifaceted, requires a high level of organization and collaborative response in terms of detecting anomalous events. So not just contained and constrained to cybersecurity controls, although notwithstanding that in terms of to actively tackle and mitigate bot attacks, your defensive controls need to be multi-layered, and I think focus on reducing availability at scale to minimize the desirability to attack your business.
And so you're obviously from a telecommunications background, and so what do you think that businesses, obviously telecommunications, you are going to experience this on quite a vast scale. What kind of other businesses do you think are going to be experiencing these types of attacks?
I think any business that has a digital presence is at risk from bot attacks, irrespective of their product and service that they offer.
And why is it so important? This might be more of a question for Cyril, so please do feel free to jump in. Why do you think it's so important to understand the volumes at which these attacks take place?
I think because these attacks, unlike a ransomware attack, which is going to be in your face, there's going to be a ransom note there. You're going to know you've been attacked. These can go under the radar a little bit, and as a result, people might underappreciate the volume of these attacks and the actual risk to their business. So I think it's really important to understand the volumes, and only then can you start to understand the impact and start dealing with the problem.
And that's something that we've seen throughout this report, that businesses are experiencing an increase in not necessarily the size of attacks, even though we think that is what's happening, but that they're experiencing more attacks, and that is across the board. So whether it's sniping or scraping or credential stuffing. And we're also noticing that attacks are coming from like a myriad of different locations, from the US and the UK, where we've seen a lot of attacks over previous years, but we're also seeing an increase in attacks from other locations. So, for instance, this year we saw that attacks from Russia increased 82% in the last 2 years, and 11% since sanctions were introduced in early 2020. So, Rob, what do you think the correlation might be, or what correlation could we potentially draw between geopolitical events and the automated attacks that we're seeing here?
Well, I think probably first of all is to pick up on Tom's point about, if you're a digital organization or you have a digital dimension, you're going to be a potential victim. I think the first significant geopolitical development is to actually recognize and realize that in today's age, it's very difficult to be a successful business without having a digital presence, a digital position that can be attacked. And for a lot of our concerns about cybersecurity, we've often had the challenge of cybersecurity professionals, the CISO, really struggle to get the message across to the board about business impact. And I think the unique things about these attacks, perhaps not the unique thing, the significant things about these attacks, as Cyril's highlighted with the Blade framework, is that these affect the business bottom line right away and don't necessarily fit in your traditional cybersecurity mindset of defend the network, defend the information. And actually, the bottom line, the business bottom line, is the key message here. So this should be an ability for us to engage the decision makers in the business much more effectively about why we need to think about dealing with these incidents, dealing with these types of threats, and actually nipping them as effectively as we can do in the bud. And I think when you then step back and look at the geopolitical significance of these issues, we're seeing states looking for ways to achieve effect on the international stage without necessarily going to the normal traditional levers of power, levels of force. So sub-threshold warfare, hybrid warfare as it's called, is now one of the most effective ways of achieving your influence around the world. And Russia and China in particular have got vast efforts and capabilities being developed in this space. And I think we're now beginning to see where they've built capabilities that might sit outside of formal government control, but have a close working relationship with the secret services or the intelligence infrastructure, that it's not quite clear how directly tasked or how associated they are. But what we do know is they're a very effective organized criminal gang activity that can be focused and targeted in certain areas at the whim of some of the political leaderships in these countries. And I think that's the interesting dimension we're seeing, that even if they're not being directly tasked, they've learned that there's a business model out there that is very effective and very fruitful for them, and they're continuing to operate, and they have a dimension of influence by the Kremlin or Beijing that might well be able to exploit that when they need to, when the political situation at the international stage requires them to put a little bit of pressure on the world or around the world in other means beyond the traditional diplomacy, military confrontation, and so on.
Gosh, that's really interesting. So do you think that is causing a real shift in, well, I suppose not even just cyber warfare, but warfare generally, and how what does that look like?
Yeah,
politically,
I think we're seeing, there's a political commentator, Pete Promantsev, talking about the Kremlin, talking about how we've gone from an age of the politics of force to the age of the force of politics. And that shift has been, in the past, you used to put your gunboat off the coast and used to threaten the nation with, if you don't do what we want you to do, we'll bomb you. Now it's actually a lot more easier to get the influence by just shaping and conducting the population, whether we see the Brexit referendum, the US presidential elections, and the disinformation around that, but actually more broader than just direct messaging and influence. Economic coercion, the use of proxy forces, which is cyber at the heart, activities like this, where they're actually just shaping and engaging the population's activities and ease of activity, which is at the heart of, if you think of any of our nation's cybersecurity strategies, protecting our digital economy, protecting the means with which we can conduct e-commerce is at the heart and a key priority for our governments. So this is an obvious means to achieve that influence and achieve that effect in today's modern age. With a lot less direct accountability, it's much more harder to point the finger at a nation state and say it's them and we're going to do something about it. If you think about the MH17 incident, the downing of the Malaysian Airlines plane, it was very difficult to attribute that back and have all of your domestic population agree with you and all of your allies agree with you, and therefore adopt a course of action that everyone bought into. There was a lot of disinformation around that made it much more difficult for the allies to say, it was them, those pesky Russians, we're going to do something about it.
So how do we determine the source of any attack then? Is there a way to look at that? This might be another one for Cyril. So for instance, if they're using proxies, for instance, vulnerable infrastructure, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult for any organization to say with certainty where an attack's come from. Whether it's proxies or virtual private networks, it's really trivial for an attacker to spoof an IP address or location that they've come from to route their attack through multiple intermediaries before it actually reaches their destination. So I think you have to take some of these numbers, just realize that is the case before looking at these numbers. And even to put up on kind of what Rob was saying, there might be some softer kind of geopolitical incentives to attack from, let's say, a Russia and China, in that you're less likely to be extradited and prosecuted, right? So if you seem to be in the UK, the law enforcement might follow you a bit more than if you seem to be in a different jurisdiction. So that's something to consider. But in terms of the kind of proxy networks, what we've seen recently is a growth of especially residential proxies, whether that's from compromised home or kind of small business infrastructure, IT infrastructure, or even these passive income applications that you can download on your phone and share your internet connection to whoever wants to use it, right, for a few extra pennies or pounds a month. And these attackers can just route their attacks through those and seemingly appear in the US if they need to appear like they're in the US, or appear from elsewhere if that serves their purpose better.
And so to go back to Rob's point then, is the purpose of doing that to, I suppose, throw blame elsewhere, for want of a better term, for an attack? Or is it, what else might we expect to see? Or expect the purpose of that?
I guess from a state perspective, if you don't mind me jumping in, deniable attacks are very much core to the sub-threshold warfare strategy. So anything that you can make it difficult to be attributed by, let alone for the benefit of not being caught at the individual level anyway, having those deniable capabilities, which you're about to jump through, proxy through, even potentially shape false flagging activities, is something that would be very appealing. I think what we've really got to be conscious to is, as much as we might sort of suggest it's all done at the state level and with state instruction, I think there might be opportunities and windows where certain political tensions might bubble up, and there might be an instruction or an encouragement. But I think just actually more broad than that, you've got, the Kremlin has always had a handful of trusted associates around Putin who are, in essence, corrupt elites who own different capabilities that are very responsible for or have maintained their power through corrupt deals and dubious activities. And in this instance, they have a team of organized criminal groups, whether they be posting fake information, whether they be conducting these type of activities. And those groups have some freedom and autonomy to go and find business, bring money in, and become successful criminals. But at the same time, there's this lever of influence over them at all times. The corrupt oligarch can only do so much before Putin or someone in the Kremlin drops a lever down and says, look, you just need to remember where your loyalty are, and we need your help here. So we might see the tasking come at certain points, but in the meantime, they'll be free to carry on doing activities which would allow them to bring in quite a healthy income, to be honest, certainly more than academics, that's for sure.
But we're not naming any names here or, casting aspersions.
Sure, absolutely.
One of the really interesting stats here is that absolutely enormous 48% from Vietnam, which feels like a huge anomaly. Like, does anybody have any thoughts on why we might see this absolutely enormous number coming from Vietnam in terms of the number of attacks that have been identified as a source origin?
I guess when I was reading this report, that really did surprise me, and I was wondering whether it actually speaks to infrastructure availability and maybe the lack of security of that said infrastructure, for example, IoT devices. And I didn't know, Cyril, if you had a view on that, or Rob even.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. So some of the research our team has done previously was looking at the infrastructure there, and especially there was a boom in availability of IoT infrastructure a few years back, which with cheap IoT devices, as you're very well aware, security is often an afterthought, and security is so hard to do after, which caused a lot of botnet infections. And it's been a while, and there's been efforts to clean that up, but there's still that remnant there, which is causing that boom. I think, the other interesting one here is, if you look at kind of the other 48% there being US, and population-wise, they're similar in size, kind of US and Vietnam. kind of US has got maybe 3 times the population. So just the fact that, there's so many coming from Vietnam really shows this, or so many saying that they're coming from Vietnam shows kind of how much of an IT issue at the moment there still is.
Yeah, I think that's the point, isn't it? As we've been discussing, it might look like it's being made to look like it's coming from Vietnam, but that is likely to be actors exploiting vulnerabilities in those exposed in the exposed IoT infrastructure.
I guess Danny, if I could jump in, I think I wouldn't necessarily rule out there being increasing activity in Vietnam. I know we've talked about the potential for it to be proxied through that, but again, cyber is interesting and different, or the digital age is interesting and different. It brings us asymmetric players to the stage in a way that we've never seen before. So in the past, if you wanted to really have an effect on the political stage as a state, you really had to invest in a big army and conduct a large-scale military campaign. Now, in today's age, you can have a team of effective hackers operating, becoming an APT and having that effect as well. And I think that we've seen a shift in that dynamic and that spread. So Southeast Asian nations, Vietnam in the past has had some previous history of having some APTs based out of Vietnam and operating, for whether it be for resource gathering or intelligence gathering or what have you. So again, I think this is just another indicator of the shift of the geopolitical appreciation that cyber brings different players to the space that we haven't seen before.
And is that because it gives them access to tools that they might not have, like you just said, instead of having to amass a huge army, they can just get access to
literally, I think tools. The cost of having a botnet army is a lot cheaper than having a traditional 100,000 person army. The cost of having some appropriate cyber capabilities, whether they be from the Blade framework or some of the more traditional cyber security attack capabilities, is usually a lot cheaper than investing in a tank or a plane or an army of tanks as well. So we're seeing that it's actually a lot lower bar to entry to participate in cyber operations and cyber activities than it is in traditional kind of state-on-state conflict.
Of course, yeah.
And obviously you've got the geopolitical reach. You don't have to just attack your neighbor. You can attack anyone in the world as well.
And you can essentially get paid for it, I suppose, in lots of instances. You can farm out your resources.
Absolutely. And so you could be tasked by anyone. That's the other thing as well. Just because you're operating in Vietnam, we've talked about ransomware as a service, and that's currently a big consideration for a lot of people thinking about cybersecurity threats. There would be no issue. Anonymous used to have a website where you could, launch your own denial of service attacks just by filling in the website you want to attack and paying for the number of pings you want to send there. So it is that much a service capability. So if there's a team of effective individuals with perhaps appropriately loose regulations as to what devices are available to be exploited in Vietnam, why wouldn't you offer that as a service as well? Obviously not suggesting illegal activity myself, but you can see how that model would work.
You can, and it's something that Cyril's team have looked into a lot. So the professionalization of attacks.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we're seeing throughout the cyber underground. You mentioned ransomware as a service, and I think that's the most visible model of it, but we're seeing the exact same thing in bot attacks, whether that's from kind of your infrastructure providers, so your proxies, your VPNs, etc., through to the developers for the bots, people providing, so kind of ransomware, you'll have kind of your initial access brokers, but here people, whether they're kind of farming accounts or providing accounts where authentication is needed for the bot as well, we're seeing the very same thing.
And I suppose, does that, Cyril, also apply to, so we mentioned at the top of the webinar, normal people say beginning, I've just said top for some reason, because I feel like that's what they would say in Blue Peter. So at the top of the webinar, we discussed, an increasing number of attacks and the volume of attacks. And do you think a lot of that is a result of that professionalization, and because it makes attacks more accessible to whether you're a nation state or you are a criminal gang or you're just like a consumer and you want to get you want to carry out for whatever reason a huge sniping attack. You're unlikely to, but let's say scalping instead. Let's switch use case and go to scalping, but you want to use that skill set.
Yeah, I think so, because historically, well, at the start, right, you would have had maybe a few very skilled individuals who would be able to launch attacks, and the rest couldn't. And then they start renting out their services to provide the tools for others to launch attacks. And slowly the level of sophistication by even kind of the less skilled actors becomes higher. And then you get to the point where it's almost a commodity. Anyone can go on a bot marketplace and rent out a bot for a day to launch a scalping attack, with little to no technical knowledge required. So it's only going to get worse as well, right? As long as the bot developers keep, innovating and developing bots and releasing them, the general public can just go out and purchase them and buy them if they're so inclined.
I think that's one of the ever increasing and growing challenges, is that it's not just around infrastructure availability, it's actually the accessibility and the ever increasing, or decreasing, I should say, skill set of an individual to go and initiate an attack on a particular given target. Also around, applications reaching the marketplace that have buried in their terms and conditions how that mobile device could actually be used by the application. So it's not just typically paid for services to where you kind of, rent out your IP space, as it were.
And so that took us quite nicely on there, Tom. I was going to try and make a what's called a very weak link to increased attacks on APIs, but you kind of did it for me by talking about apps. And so what we've seen over the last few years, as you can see in this beautiful graph, is that we've seen fairly regular amounts of traffic to websites and then to mobile apps. But this year, we've seen mobile apps for the first time overtake websites. And so that is hugely significant, as you sort of just alluded to, because what it does is illustrate the fact that attackers have identified apps as the weak link in the chain, and increasingly so also APIs. But we'll focus at first on the mobile apps. And so if they are now becoming the most common attack surface, and we think, that probably includes things like tablets as well. So people are just using their desktops less and less. What does that shift? Yeah, I'll come to you first on this, Tom, actually. So what does that shift in mobile attacks mean in terms of like the playing field and website attacks? What can we expect to see?
So I think firstly, around mobile app attacks. So in the context of a business's app being targeted over their website, as an example. So I think there are a couple of factors here. I think one is, as if we kind of look across business digital strategy in terms of how businesses are developing their digital footprint online, there's a stark increase and shift towards API and mobile app development. So thus, by businesses having that focus and direction, it naturally increases attack surface and availability for bots. There is a increased criminal attractiveness around applications, again, influenced by consumer demand. More consumers want to be mobile app based rather than website based. Equally, as part of app builds, we are increasingly seeing that apps have a significantly broad scope when it comes to capabilities. So in terms of high value customer data that could be contained behind an application. And I think because of that, again, criminals are increasingly becoming more attracted to targeting mobile applications because of the richness of the data that is contained there. I won't go into too much detail at the moment, but I also feel that with mobile app and APIs, there is probably a lack of security governance as well when it comes to development of APIs and applications. And I think that very easily leaves the door open for bots as an entry point to target mobile apps more significantly.
Yeah, I think the data in front of us kind of speaks to exactly that, doesn't it? We've seen an increase. An attacker is always going to seek the weakest link in the chain, and it's gone from, over the last few years, mobile apps into APIs, and it's because there isn't the strict legislation in place. There are a lot of open APIs out there. When we looked at this originally in 2020 and started speaking to people about APIs, the only industries reporting any attacks to their APIs were financial services, and it was because they'd all been told, because of PSD2 and open banking, to incorporate open APIs and are basically opening themselves up without much governance in place to attacks. And then we've seen e-commerce as a kind of next link in that chain start to incorporate more. We saw that big jump in 2021, but then in 2022, we saw across the board, every industry we spoke to, bar telecoms slightly. I think they have reported slightly fewer, but not by a significant amount. On average, 40% of our respondents reporting that they'd experienced API attacks. It wasn't just like we had a huge number of financial services and a huge number of e-commerce, which had happened the previous 2 years, making up that 39% and 23% respectively. It was across the board, everything had kind of evened out, which we can assume may mean that FS and e-commerce have started to get a handle on, securing their APIs. And, while the others are kind of playing catch up, but are more aware of the, what the level of threat they're exposed to. So I'm really interested to hear from you, Cyril, on this. So what is it about APIs that makes them such a great target for attackers? And what should businesses be doing to secure them? If we think they are now securing them, there's obviously still a need to do more. What is that?
Well, so APIs are built for kind of machine-to-machine communication. So right off the bat, you're already speaking the bot's language. Automation and APIs fit together like a glove. So if you're putting APIs out there and you're not protecting them, you're exposing that business logic, then of course bots are going to attack them. If you take, for example, a scraping attack, right? A bot could either go onto your website and try and understand the flow of your website and scrape the data from that and have to parse stuff out, or it can just hit that API and just pull all that data back, nicely formatted in JSON or whatever, whatever format it's expecting it in. So that's really why kind of bots are going to attack APIs. And then you add to that the fact that many companies have APIs out there that they might not even be aware of. If you're not aware of an API, then I'm not sure how you're going to actually protect it. Then that kind of compounds the issue. So in terms of what kind of businesses can do to start protecting these API endpoints, I guess the first thing is discovery. So understanding what APIs are out there, looking a bit at your process and actually what business logic you want to expose via APIs. Maybe not being so quick to put everything behind an API because it's easier for your developers internally, because it could also be easier for bots as well. But then on top of that, putting some technologies behind those APIs or in front of those APIs to limit bot attacks on them.
Rob, I could see you nodding vigorously there.
I guess as a reflection of this graph, I think the key for this graph to me is the expanding optics or the expanding scope of your security footprint in this. Back in the old days, and I'm hastening to suggest that 2020 isn't quite the old days, but we were just worrying about websites primarily. The traditional defend your territory, defend your network, that was your internet-facing footprint. Now we've got mobile apps, we've got APIs, almost constantly connected, constantly engaged, data flowing. If data's the new oil, that's the new pipeline. You can just see how DevSecOps has to become built in from the start on almost everything, because actually everything is an attack surface. We know that, but the mindset shift, I think, at the board level has to now be, okay, with these new integrated capabilities that are providing better services for our clients, and we want our clients to be on our mobile apps because then they don't have to go to another person's mobile apps. We've got the APIs going. That actually just creates more vulnerability for attacks like this in particular, which can tap into that rich vein, but not necessarily be seen as a strategic cyber incident or something like that. So we've got an additional set of attack capabilities that are being shown in this report that are just tapping into the data flow, the information flow, the business competitive edge that you've got because of the way that you are engaging with your employees, your customers, your clients, and the broader world. And I think that's what's really exciting in that slide, or scary, depending on how you see it.
Depending on where you're sitting, whether you're in the security team or you're the attacker.
Well, it's a great way to justify your budget in the security team, at least, if nothing else. Perhaps it's the good way to see it like that.
Absolutely. So what we've also seen over the last few years is the number of attacks reported, so across different use cases, increase. And so in 2022, phenomenally, we can see 99% of businesses across the board reporting they've experienced all attacks. And in telco in particular, we saw and online entertainment, we saw 66% of businesses report that they've seen a significant rise in bot volumes, with over a quarter of businesses also seeing a significant increase in gift card attacks. Cyril, could you quickly define what gift card cracking attacks are?
Yeah, the ultimate goal here is for an attacker to steal the balance on a gift card. So generally they're doing this by enumerating variations of the gift card number until they find a card with a balance. And they can do this in a number of ways. Typically, it's an organization will have a gift card balance checking application or API endpoint. And the attacker will just enumerate through variations of gift card numbers until they find one that works, and then sell that on or use themselves.
So is that something that we see in particular across certain industries? Tom, I can see here that we've got a increase as I mentioned, that we had like 66% of telcos reporting that they saw a significant increase in bot attacks. Is it attacks like card cracking, or is it more the account checker? What types of things are you seeing?
I think predominantly, so attacks, bot attacks at scale, increasingly, I think across industry forums, is that actually credential stuffing is still kind of the top marker in terms of attack type scene. And I think largely as well, that is within around scale in terms of velocity. So the significance of volume. And I think that is continued to being aggravated by the ever increasing credential sets, the data available to initiate the attack, but also, of course, the exponential growth in infrastructure.
And that's probably why we've seen that incremental increase over the last few years. It's just like, as Rob was saying a few minutes ago, it's that accessibility online. It's just everything is available on the web. We've got resources available that weren't available even as recently as 3 years ago. And times are changing very quickly. Attackers are becoming more sophisticated much more quickly. And a lot of that will be down to things like the professionalization of the services that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so if we think about the types of bots that have attacked, so as we've seen an increase, we saw businesses reporting general increases. We can see that snipers were amongst the top reported, with 49% reporting sniper attacks, account checker 45%, and then scraper 33%. So these are absolutely enormous volumes of attacks.
So can I just jump in there, if I may, Danny? I think it's really interesting. The word attack there jumps out to me. Some of those, I think the really interesting thing about those reports is the increase in the capabilities of an automated bot capability to do whatever you choose to do with it. Some of those activities are most definitely illegal and inappropriate. The gift cards, for example, the fake account creation and the credential stuffing. But some of those capabilities and activities are being done in an almost legitimately acceptable way, but perhaps not at scale. So if you think about the sniping or the, I'm trying to think of the other example, the sniping where you're jumping in at last minute at scale, that the business transaction is still a legitimate business transaction. It might just not be an appropriate scale or quantity that you would be hoping for as a business. So I think we've got to really see the increase in technology is one thing, but is it necessarily right to see it as attack, or is it something the business wants to stop? If it's still selling its product at the end of the day at the price it wanted to, does it matter if it's sold it through to an automated capability? Question mark. There's lots of reasons why you might not want to sell it like that, but actually that capability might well be one that is acceptable or not necessarily illegal.
I mean, that's a really interesting one, and kind of scalping is kind of one of the main ones to look at there as well, because you've got some things like tickets, for example, where scalping is illegal, and then you've got other things where it's not. But in both cases, and as kind of this report shows, there's still a financial impact to scalping, whether that's because customers aren't coming back because they feel like they can't get what they want, or maybe they wouldn't just bought that one item, they would have bought other items, and there's still a loss that organizations are seeing. So I guess to your point, should we call an attack or not? If they're losing, if there's an impact, they can call an attack, but is it illegal? In some cases, not.
But I think that's absolutely key, Cyril, in that one, because I think that's the justification for the business to do something about it, because clients are being turned away or disappointed or disillusioned with the service they were expecting. I mean, I don't need to mention Taylor Swift, or I can't remember which brand it was in the US, which ended up having to pay back some of their clients, some of their customers, because of the scalping or the sniping and scalping that occurred, that meant ticket prices were astounding prices. So it's having that reputational impact, it's having that business impact, even if it's not necessarily illegal. So that's why I think it falls into the envelope of responsibility of the business cybersecurity team to do something about it.
I think you're both absolutely right. And it takes us really nicely onto what these attacks are actually costing businesses. And it's not just the direct costs. So for instance, if you're talking about what we're kind of flipping between terming a account checker bot / a credential stuffing bot attack. And so whether you're comparing that to a scalper bot attack or a scraper attack, so whether it's a low and slow or it's a brute force, you've got direct costs and indirect costs associated with that, and what that means to the business. So if you were talking about ransomware attacks, that is a shock to the business. They're saying, oh, I've got to pay this business, I've got to pay X amount, which could be around $1 million a pop, to the attackers, which feels like a huge blow. But then what we're seeing with the cumulative cost and financial impact of bots is a very different thing. It's as the name of our report this year alludes, it's a slow bleed. It's that slow chipping away that is causing almost an erosion of your finances that over the years is, costing businesses, and over the course of 1 year, even costing them an awful lot of money. So I'll put it to Tom first. Do you think that there is a bias within businesses to try and tackle those real big brute force attacks like ransomware, and even things like putting money aside for GDPR fines or whatever it is? I don't know if businesses do that. That could be a very non-compliant thing to say. But is there a bias towards tackling those types of attacks versus the seemingly less visible bot attacks?
So I guess, firstly, I'll state from a security point of view, any responsible organisation who cares and wishes to protect its company's data and its customers' data, irrespective of the threat type, will always look to protect its customers, and also to point that any customer data that is exposed, irrespective of threat type, is also reportable. I think that the significant challenge here is the immeasurability of what impacts on businesses due to a cumulative bleed over time. So in the context of, for example, a ransomware attack, at a board level, at a risk level, it would be very straightforwardly quantifiable to say if our business became under a ransomware attack and our website became unavailable for a day, at a very straightforward level, to measure the impact of loss of sales because of that. Beyond anything else, that would be the most straightforward, easiest way to assess an initial risk to a business. So I don't think it's a bias. I think actually it comes down to how a business can actually measure the impact over time.
Danny, can I jump in as well? I think building on Tom's point, exactly. I think that's it. If you take the word cyber out of this, and I've always been encouraged whenever you're thinking about a cybersecurity issue, take cyber out and then see how you do it. This is no different to shoplifting. And the analogy of shoplifting, I wouldn't see shoplifting necessarily getting board level attention, but shoplifting at a scale where you're losing revenue at this amount would potentially be an agenda on the board, an item on the board's agenda, and they'd be looking at what mitigations and measures you're putting in place. So just because it doesn't have the strategic shoplift level that a one-off strategic cyber attack incident would have, doesn't mean that that you can just ignore it and let it drain away, because you're losing a vast amount of money. So I think that's the challenge that I think we need to really bring to the fore, is how do we start reporting this, and how do we start bringing this to board level attention, at what threshold and at what push point? Because I'm sure every business, unfortunately, has an error bar for number of items lost due to shoplifting in a supermarket, for example. But at what point would you step up and say, right, we need to put new preventative measures in? We need to put the boxes in a supermarket around your CDs or your computer games, so that there's an alarm system. So when you take it outside we need to put an increased number of security guards. Those are the conversations we need to be having in a virtual cyber-related incident that might be very different from your traditional cyber defense measures that you'd put into protecting a network. These might be other indicators and other criteria that we'd be looking at.
Yeah, and it makes total sense. And it's something that is, even on the topic of shoplifting, hit the news recently, because that exact thing in bricks and mortar stores is happening. And it's almost like we're paying attention to it in one area, but in the bricks and mortar sense, but we're not paying attention to it online. So these attacks, I suppose, are bot attacks, do we think, always financially driven, or is it, I suppose, Bob, probably back to you, Rob, with this, is it often a case of, they're financially and politically driven? Do we think that there are motives from bot attacks going from east to west, or is that just something that, is that seeding political unrest?
So I think the quick answer to your question is yes, and yes to everything. I think we are seeing certain threat actors that are using it as a financial business model, in the same way as ransomware as a service. We're seeing certain threat actors who might have state associations, which are being kind of let off the leash a bit when the state wants to exert some influence and pressure. And I again touch on Russia. Russia traditionally has had a foreign policy that is kind of purposefully blurring the lines between economics and politics. So for them to not think that this is a useful and worthwhile route to exploit, I think would be underestimating that. So I think there is definitely some state association to some of the taskings, and potentially a way of undermining particular economies. I think there was a report in the papers recently about the Chinese activities investing in the electricity supply networks around Europe to put that additional pressure in. Why wouldn't they want to be conducting activities that would undermine certain economic or organizations that would be successful? So you would have the overt confrontation of those businesses with perhaps competitor and rival businesses, but at the same time you might see covert hidden hand activities to try and undermine the confidence in certain institutions, such that the trade or business would move elsewhere as well. And I think that would just be standard tactics about achieving dominance and influence in the digital age.
And so if it's taking businesses or taking anyone such a long time, so as we can see here, a really long time to detect that bot attacks have even occurred, what advantage does that put politically motivated attacks at, do you think? You can divert this to Cyril if you'd like.
Well, so I guess I find For me, the time dimension is really interesting because I think it again highlights how the activity can be going on all the time. It might only be triggered when there's an increase in activity or an increasing number of bots. So I'm not sure here where length of time before realizing attack is actually the metric that's most important. I think it's really interesting. It shows that we're not seeing this in our standards indicator and warning processes. This isn't being flagged up in the same way as your traditional cybersecurity dashboard reporting. But if you're losing 5% of your revenue through this way, you certainly want to make sure you've got indicators and warnings coming up, and actually you want to be mitigating and reducing the time that these bots are operating on your patch, taking away your profit. So we obviously want to reduce that margin down, but I think for me this spells a shift in focus, or perhaps an expansion of focus of the reporting. So it might be that we're having sales team report the fact that the latest release sold out in near instant real time, which probably means there wasn't a bunch of thousands and thousands of customers sitting there typing in their password, credit card details, because that takes at least 2 minutes, or at least it does when I try and type my credit card in. But in 30 seconds, we had 100,000 sales. That was probably a series of bots doing that. We need to pay attention to this, and that reporting is very different to your cybersecurity reporting. So that's where I would probably say that's the really interesting bit here, because we're not picking this up in the traditional ways.
And I think kind of at the very top of the webinar, that was kind of my point around your operating model in terms of your response has to be multi-team led, multifaceted. It cannot solely rest on a cybersecurity team. To Rob's point, the low and slow attacks may not be detected by traditional defenses, yet you have 5% of a given product or revenue stream lost month to month. So I think that it is really interesting.
That it takes everybody in the business prioritizing this and being aware of it. So as you just said, Tom, it can't just be security teams, it's got to be your e-commerce teams. And I think that's often the case, isn't it, Cyril, that it's those outside the security team. The security team is often last to know that bot attacks are becoming a problem.
Right, and then again, I'll compare it to your traditional cyber attacks, which these days are, for the most part, cyber extortion attacks, right? So whether it's ransomware or DDoS or something else, even when those are looking at availability, so those are clear. You've lost availability, you want to get it back. So you need to pay a ransom or something. Or even when you have data exfiltration attacks, a lot of these are still being used for extortion, where they'll advertise the fact that they've got the data and ask you to pay something to get it back. So it's quite easy for security teams to see that if their traditional reporting tools have missed the attack and let it actually happen. With automated bot attacks, is often the customer who's seeing the availability impact. So for scalping, the customer was not able to buy an item because it's run out of stock. They're seeing the availability impact, so they're seeing the attack and they're reporting it. Or if we take something like credential stuffing or a gift card, they no longer have that gift card balance because someone else has used it. They're seeing that availability impact, they're informing the business. And often that might be coming through to a customer service team or another part of the business. So unless you've got those silos broken down, you're not going to see these attacks.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the people who should own the problem. It just means that everybody needs to know about it, understand it, and prioritize it within the business.
I think the gift card one's the most obvious one. I would love to know, if I just use the gift card example, the reporting network or the reporting process on gift cards usage, because I'm sure there's a peak around Christmas time when everyone gets gift cards or so on. And then after that, it probably drops off to a relatively steady rate. But I wonder at what point anyone in any business would flag up, we've had a 10% increase in gift card usage this month. That's a bit strange. I just don't think that would hit anyone's radar at all.
And I think perhaps, this is kind of an operational maturity challenge as well, is to look at trend analysis right across the business in response to defending better against bot attacks. It is not just a cybersecurity event responsibility. It's also a responsibility to go and look at anomalies in your product portfolio reporting, as an example, and to call that out at the earliest opportunity. You kind of have we've seen an elevation in account creations this month. But what does our data tell us? What is a normalized level of account creations? Can we attribute that increase to a specific event? If not, let's start an investigation. And that will massively improve dwell time in terms of detection and also minimization of impact to your business.
And so we're kind of talking about this at the moment in the context of people who are aware of it and know to prioritize it. But what we actually saw in the results of our survey was, hang on a minute, let me not get this stat wrong. So yeah, our data report, we found out that 55% of businesses reported a reduced amount of concern for bots versus last year, which seems counterintuitive to all the numbers that we've seen so far today. And does that indicate a bit of a red flag that they're not going to then, if they're less concerned, do we think that means it's been almost deprioritized, even though they're having a greater impact?
I don't know if there's such a thing as bot fatigue, but we might be there already.
Yeah. Potentially.
I mean, I guess it does depend on who was the reporting individual on the interviews. I could see where, in a year where we've had increasing ransomware as a service attacks or increasing other types of attacks, you might feel that the CISO is distracted by other more strategic considerations, perhaps. I think the key challenge here is how does the CISO take account of these type of issues, and as well as still keeping their eye on the strategic strike, the strategic attack capabilities. Because again, as we've already said, if you're losing 5% of your revenue and you're not even noticing it all the time, that's a big problem. You might still have the kind of ground zero days where the business gets wiped out off the internet for a couple of days and you have to rebuild it from scratch or what have you. Yes, you still need to plan for that, but if you're still leaving that 5%, then if you're in revenues and sales, you would be held to accountable to doing that as well. So it does become a pressing issue, even if it isn't necessarily as newspaper headline centric as some of the other attacks we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put like that 5% into context, of the businesses we spoke to, the average amount annually for their online revenue for the 4.3% equated to £85.6 million, which is a huge chunk of money. And that's for the average enterprise. So if we think 440 enterprises are losing 85.6 million a year to bots, and 55% of both those businesses are less concerned about bots than they were last year. It
shows the challenges that we need to take.
Exactly, yeah. It shows that message needs to, well, I suppose this kind of brings us full circle. What can we do to help businesses articulate the challenge as emphatically as possible to the board and really raise its profile?
Is that to me?
It's to anybody who would like to answer it, Cyril.
So I think security teams need to start kind of taking the mantle here, because even though we said this is something that the whole business needs to own and we need different kind of teams in the business, security are the ones who at the moment seem to have the responsibility, and they kind of need to drive it. They need to kind of educate other parts of the business and help them to be able to articulate kind of three main things. I'd say the threat, so kind of what are automated attacks and how do they work? And for that, I think the Blade framework is a great resource that they should use. But apart from the threats, the business needs to understand and be able to articulate what the attack surface is and how that's grown. It's not just websites anymore. As you're trying to release new features, new apps, new APIs, these need to be protected. And it's not just protect APIs now and forget about the rest. Whichever one you don't protect is the one that's going to get attacked. But then also the impact. And this report's a good example of just showing that impact is vast. It's 5% is like, well, that's a GDPR level fine there, right? And you saw the effort that people went through to GDPR to kind of protect against those fines. So security needs to help the rest of the business understand those three elements. And then once those are understood, you can start implementing the right processes and technologies to deal with the threat. But you need to make sure you've got a feedback loop as well, because as this survey has shown, kind of that the concern becoming less shows that there's not the right feedback loop in place. Maybe people have put in some measures and they think, okay, we're dealing with this threat now. And because there's not the feedback loop, they can't see that actually there's still this problem and there's still bleeding this level of resource of finances.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The feedback loop and just giving attacks or giving this issue as much visibility as possible on like that regular basis, constantly. It's the consistency, I think, isn't it, of reporting? Great. Would anybody else like to add anything to that? How we help businesses really?
I think there's some also different perspectives. Again, if we break down the different attack typologies, I think we could probably handle some of them very differently. So, if you look at sniping, again, the question over whether or not it's an appropriate business tactic or not, but at scale, probably a challenge. We've seen some business incorporate a kind of internal or an indigenous sniping capability as part of the of standard business. So you as a customer can choose to, auto bid on your auction, or you can choose to have that sniping capability included. So they've actually addressed that threat by including it as kind of core business. And that might be one of the ways of reducing down the attack surface. So again, I think we need to break down the typologies and work out for each of the different actions or attack types, how we might go and approach them as well.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And it's ultimately why we talk about business logic attacks and why we develop the Blade framework. It's determining the difference between a malicious use of legitimate functionality versus a legitimate use of legitimate functionality that's being used for the purpose in which it was created without anybody trying to exploit it, which is what we see across the board. Not across the board, but a lot, and what we reported on today. But thank you all for joining us today. It has been a fantastic session. We've gone really deep into certain areas here because they are just so interesting. I think I could talk to all of you all day about all of this, but unfortunately we only have an hour. So thank you so much for joining us. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to put to our fantastic panel, please do feel free to share them and we will follow up after the webinar. You can contact us via our social channels on Twitter, LinkedIn and Instagram, or you can send them to hello@netacea.com. Thank you all, and I hope to see you all on our next webinar.